Let's pray. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and all our ideas and all our many blessings, may they be a pleasure to you. May they be for your service. Amen. Good morning again. Hope the holiday was great. We're still recovering. I got thinking about the ghosts of Thanksgiving past. And there was this one Thanksgiving, I brought it up with my dad, we were together, where my grandfather, he's a Baptist minister, he sort of lorded over the big family Thanksgivings whenever we all got together. He was the boss of Thanksgiving dinner. And one year, he did this thing where before we could eat, we listened to the story of the first Thanksgiving. I'm not sure where he got it, but he got it. And this had a kind of rosy depiction of friendship and abundance between the Pilgrims and the Indians. And from what I've heard from some of you, this is not unlike Thanksgiving pageants that happened right here at First Congregational. It's okay. We all were raised with this. It's all right. Well, for us as kids, it was a little boring. You're kind of hungry to eat. But the takeaways are clear. The takeaways, the big themes are gratefulness for friends, family, and food, but also, because we're now getting into Advent, an appreciation of God's approaching peace. This was also the moment every year where we would sort of initiate Advent by that quote from the book of Luke, "May we have peace on earth and goodwill to men." We'd pray that as part of our Thanksgiving feast prayer every year. Peace on earth, goodwill to men. If you're not a woman, that's lovely. It's great. But, of course, either way, it begs the question, what is peace? What's peace? What is it? Do we know? And how would we follow the way of peace that Jesus seems to suggest? And if we ask the book of John, for those of you first time here today, we're going through the book of John. If you ask the book of John, what is peace? It describes something, peace, as being very different if it's God's peace or if it's the world's peace. In John, the world's peace is described as that force in the world which is maintained by the twin pillars of lies and violence. Here, the world's peace in John is described as a peace which defends and maintains the oppressive status quo. In this case, the Pax Romana, something that serves a privileged few in the center of cities, but exports the war out to the edges and the periphery. In contrast, Jesus describes something different in opposition to that. God's peace is described as the liberating force of truth-telling and compassion. And as disciples of Jesus, if this is going to be a living language and not an old dead Latin one, we are told to follow that. Truth-telling and compassion. So this morning, as a kind of holiday treat, I know we're all still shaking off the turkey, some, let's call them critical truth-telling reflections on the first Thanksgiving. Let's think about it just for a second, because it's an amazing, amazing story and worthy of retelling. It's good stuff. First, I don't think any of us can possibly imagine with our brains what it must have been like to be a regular human in Europe back from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Something world-changing happened. Not only had the shape and nature of our planet changed, like all science as we know it, gone. But in the balance of that earth-shaking change, we discover that there is a lost continent out there. That there is literally another place that anyone can get to using conventional technology. Whoa. And the equivalent today, and there's no internet, so this must have spread slowly, like an urban legend at first, or like this secret underground science fiction story that's passing around through people. But The equivalent might be like if our science just went out the window, like what if CNN says there is an alternate dimension? And there's another plane of existence out there. Can't get there from a map, but using technology that you might have in your closet. And if you have enough money to, say, modify a vintage sports car, you can get through a DeLorean right through the shield, 88 miles an hour, you can get there. Wow, that would be amazing. And this is exactly what happened. The years pass, and exploration continues to this new amazing Atlantis place. This other continent, and the people bring back stories of exotic inhabitants and unlimited resources. Alien artifacts come back made of gold, art we've never seen before. Alien species of plants so much more efficient than wheat grain that it could solve that hunger problem overnight, change the economy of Europe, and it did. It threw Europe over, upside down, all over again. And throughout the 1500s, governments and private companies raided and exploited this lost continent. They brought stuff back. People started funding expeditions to this other world. As time passed, it became clear then, after this kind of normalized, this new shock, that we now need permanent worker colonies set up there to facilitate this new salvation of Europe, because Europe was crowded and had trouble before. So, Thanksgiving legend quickly goes from being this science fiction story that we don't tell because very quickly it becomes an immigration story. Totally different kind of tale. Immigrants arrive on North America, and they named Plymouth Rock one of the very first settlements of the world, of the New World. They don't actually call themselves pilgrims ever. They don't wear, I know, shock, belt buckles on their hats. I'm not sure where that happened. I don't get it. But they were, in fact, English Protestants. And they were fleeing religious persecution in England. First, they went to Amsterdam. They resettled in Amsterdam first, big industrial city at the time. But adjusting poorly to the city, they were having trouble. Their kids were picking up all these weird customs and habits. They were farmers, and so they didn't really know how to live in this burned-out industrial behemoth of Amsterdam. And so they began looking for a new home where they would be free of any cultural outside influence. That's what they wanted. They said it. You can read all their papers. It's not like a billion years ago. So, seemingly, their prayers get answered in the form of the Merchant Adventurers Company, which sounds like a fly-by-night organization, but it felt like, okay, adventure, merchant, this is great. And it offered to pay all of this group all their expenses if they would go to the New World, and they would give them everything they need to get set up there, so long as they paid off the debt of that investment and eventually make the company a little profit once they got there. And like all immigrants, they lived in hope. So they did it. They did it. They were looking for a better life, trying to figure it all out. And they went, took a bold leap. Okay, that part we all know. Here comes the tough part of the story. And we all know this part too, because maybe we think about it a couple times a year. I'm not being harsh, I'm just saying, right? We don't think about it all the time. But we all know some part of it. The first Thanksgiving is not only a science fiction story or an immigration story, it's also a tragedy. A tragedy so vast, it's become invisible. So big, can't quite see the edges of it. Can't take in what it means. Don't know what to do. We would, but we can't quite see it. Let's name what it is. Because, of course, the New World was not so new to the indigenous people who lived here. They existed in vast, they had cities. It's not the picture in those paintings in the Met in New York. There was a vast civilization here. And in 1617, its longtime inhabitants contracted a plague from British fishermen, a plague that made Europe's Black Death seem pale by comparison. By the time the Mayflower lands 3 years after that, 90 to 96% of all the coastal inhabitants of New England were killed. That's shocking. The society was devastated. That recorded death rate is higher than any and all previous human existence. It is so big. In a journal, Mayflower Journal, Howard Simpson describes what the scene was like that the Congregationalists all saw when they landed, pamphlet in hand, excitement. He says, villages lay in ruins because there was no one to tend them. And the ground was strewn with the skulls and the bones of thousands of Indians who had died because there was no one left to bury them. So they landed in a post-apocalyptic landscape. The newfound Plymouth colony settled in their abandoned towns, farmed in their pre-set, laid out, abandoned fields. And all of this, you can read about all of this, they even robbed their graves when circumstances demanded it. Even still, the immigrants had a tough time that first winter. Out of the 102 who sent out, only 53 survived that first year. It's horrible. Then the event, later claimed as the first Thanksgiving, was in fact a desperate act of diplomacy between two radically different groups that didn't understand each other, didn't know. The badly weakened colonists with the devastated Wampanoag tribe. It was a brief, necessary partnership between two cultures, and it would ultimately lead to one entirely devastating the other in a myriad of ways. Within 50 years, just about all the remaining Wampanoags and the other tribes of this area were dead, either because of the colonists' germs or the colonists' guns. One murder of a white person, and they go crazy in a couple of years. You can read about it. Kill hundreds and hundreds, okay? Now, whether we call this a science fiction story, an immigration story, or a tragedy, horrible tragedy, it's clear what this story became over time. Now, people didn't celebrate Thanksgiving since that time. It didn't really emerge until later, but it becomes a proof text. It became a symbol for God's grace and favor to the English settlers. A proof text of Christian values and its ability to wrestle civilization out of the wilderness. Eventually, it becomes a call to America's manifest destiny in the world. It's right to take Christendom. Doesn't become an official holiday until Abraham Lincoln realizes the country needs some morale, and he names it a holiday in 1863. Even then, it isn't linked to stories of the Pilgrim Fathers. That doesn't happen until the 1890s. Isn't it strange how we talk about somebody else, it's immigrants, but when it's us, it's Pilgrim Fathers? Okay? So stories change over time. They drift, take on new aspects. What do we make of this? Obviously, there has always been this critique on Thanksgiving from every middle child in every family since the dawn of Thanksgivings. But let's just name the critique. Let's just name the things that somebody in your family is saying every year. I don't know who it is. In my family, it's me. It's summarized by Professor Robert Jensen. He says that the main rap against Thanksgiving is that European invaders ultimately exterminate nearly the entire indigenous population of North America, and without this Holocaust, the United States as we know it would not exist. And yet we celebrate Thanksgiving as a holiday dominated not by an atonement for this horrendous tragedy and our part in it in some way, but by a falsified account, a lie, about the first gathering between Europeans and Native Americans. This distortion, according to Jensen and me, intellectually dishonest and morally bankrupt. And if we're going to be Christians and actually take serious the role of peacekeeping, peacemaking, we could only do so by rejecting our own lies and violence, even if we didn't know or what. Now, of course, not all Christians agree at all with what I'm saying. And maybe you're one of those Christians who doesn't really buy this or don't like it or don't agree with it. That's fine. I first heard the traditional counter-argument from my childhood pastor because I was saying this stuff early on. I was like, wait a minute. And it's a weak argument in my mind, but I'm going to repeat it because it's right now still being preached in churches, lectures, Dharma halls, synagogues across the United States this very morning. It's still being said in some way or another. It goes like this. What happened to the Native Americans was a terrible, shameful thing. But it's all in the past. It happened long ago. And although it's terrible, we can't hold on to it forever. We can't keep recycling it. And as God's inheritors of the gospel, we need to even maybe forgive our forefathers for their blindness. Yes, my pastor argued as a child. And now, Thanksgiving is a celebration, not of that. It's terrible, yes. But of our present thankfulness for God's continuing present bounty now. That's the argument that I got as a kid. And I remember my pastor even quoting from Luke chapter 6. It's burned into my mind because he's reminded me in this context that I can't remember exactly how he framed it. It's like, you shouldn't worry about what you're going to eat and drink. We should be thankful for that. And he quoted that thing where it says that God takes care of us in the same way he takes care of the birds of the air, which is really ironic because this is the holiday where we kill the birds of the air and eat them with our mouths. So, I love Thanksgiving dinner. Don't take it personal. Not attacking anything yet. I'm just saying, it's just truth time. Let's just talk about it a little bit here together. This doesn't sit well with us, right? Every year, it doesn't sit well. Saying that God will bless only the good or chosen people, or that we're blessed because we're alive and eating, it's not only shameful, it doesn't work. Given our nation's history, it misses the point. It's not a good argument. And what is that point? What's my point? What am I doing? My point is not to say that the Pilgrims or any of you are soulless, evil monsters any more than the Native Americans were evil, soulless, subhuman monsters and all these other things that get written in those journals. I'm not here to say that. To assign evil to either side is simply a failure to understand the complexity of reality, and to fail to take responsibility for that complexity and our role in it. These are ongoing events. This is not something separated from us in time. So, my point is that as the spiritual descendants, and sometimes here the literal descendants, of that original Plymouth colony, regardless of what narrative we want to believe about our history, we are not here the way we are in 2017 with all of the war and the sexism and the racism and the plutocracy because we had peace back in 1620. We are here the way we are in 2017 because we did not have peace back in 1620. Amen. That's a fact. And if you're okay with the way things are going, that's great. I'm not sure what rock you're living under. But this didn't come out of nowhere, and it didn't start with Trump. We did this. We're doing this. We continue to do it. And on our side of history, sometimes, even if we want to say, oh, those Pilgrims, those losers, even if we want to look back and say that, which maybe it's tempting for me at 10 to say, it's easy to see their blind spots. It's easy to see what they couldn't see. It's not so easy to see what I can't see now. I need my friends to do that for me. Right? Can I recognize the blindness of my own worldview? No, I can't. I need to do it in community with all of you. I need you to point out the blindness of my worldview. Because if we forgive and forget the truths of our Pilgrim fathers, if we forgive and forget their sin as isolated and removed away from us in time, we fail to take account of our own culpability in that ongoing blindness. Although it's shifted and changed, that continues to plague us because we're still doing it. And if you don't think we're still doing it, ask any Native American you know how we're still doing it. And if you don't know any Native Americans to ask yourself why. Why is that? Because, of course, we're not just doing this to the indigenous Americans. We have a checkered history of marking all the strangers and aliens and people who seem different from us and exotic in some way as enemies and monsters to the new colony. Got to set up walls quickly, and if you don't think we're still doing it, of course, my proof, my side of the argument, is turning on the news at any time of day or night with any channel. That's my argument, Exhibit A. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving with a big feast every year, because I think we should. I'm for it. I'm still turkey drunk off of it. But I propose that if this is going to be a meaningful day of gratitude for us, it must also be a day of atonement. Holding both in tension, I propose that Thanksgiving is not entirely a science fiction story or an immigrant story or a tragedy alone, but rather, instead, Thanksgiving is a kind of American passion story. It's a story that has so much value to us because it tells us as much about what we are right now as it ever did about something else. Thanksgiving is our unacknowledged grief in the world, and I expect we are repressing it with food. Think about it. But this story, like the gospel passion story, is a living, breathing thing. It's not a history lesson. It's a present moment lesson about where we are. And if we want someone next year to do an American Thanksgiving passion story pageant, I am all for it, so long as we do it in all of its beautiful complexity. Because there is so much richness for us to share there together. It would be a way of reminding us that, like our earliest European ancestors to come upon this shore, we too can find ways to start over. Because we are, all of us, always fleeing an old country called the past. And we are, all of us, always setting foot on a new alien world called the future. In the Thanksgiving passion story, we are the ones serving the meal, and we are the ones receiving it. And the quality of that exchange, either real or imagined, will determine undiscovered futures and future American countries that we are the forebearers of. And I'm not talking in theory. I'm talking about the dinners we have right now. All of our interactions in every moment. That becomes part of the living American passion story. So I want to close, and I want to close with a first Thanksgiving prayer from the elder William Brewster, one of the Mayflower participants. And although I have no exact historical proof that it was written in this specific way, and it could be that it never even existed quite the way we have it, it was quoted like this by Linus in the Peanuts Thanksgiving special, and so that is good enough for me. We thank God for our food and our safety and a new land. And we thank God for the opportunity to create a new world for freedom and for justice. Amen.